Hello and welcome to Shaking the B2B Tree, the podcast that brings you real stories, strategies and lessons from trailblazing marketers that think and act differently to achieve success. We'll be revealing practical solutions and valuable insights from the best in business to business as they discuss their specialisms, share what works, what doesn't, and the lessons they've learned. Whether it's authentic storytelling, creating meaningful content, or generating real thought leadership, our guests have insights that can help you on the way to your next B2B marketing breakthrough. So let's get into today's conversation and see what we can shake loose. I'm joined today by Victoria Jackson of Silverdor Apartments and also my colleague Claire Lamb. We're going to be talking about the topic of B2B creativity. So before we start, Victoria, welcome. Could I ask you to just give us a quick introduction to yourself and your background in B2B?
Yeah, of course. I'm Victoria. I'm the Global Head of Marketing at Silverdor. So Silverdor is the world's leading provider of corporate accommodation for businesses. So we help businesses find their corporate housing, temporary living solutions for their travelling employees and their relocations. I've always worked in B2B. I started my career at a project and cost consultancy, so in the property and construction, but yes, very much on the professional services side. And that's where I've stayed.
Me too. So yeah, nothing wrong with that, definitely.
No.
We're asking every podcast guest what is their, apart from this podcast, obviously, what is their favourite podcast and why?
Okay, well, obviously, apart from this one, I'm definitely a religious listener to the Today podcast, but also there's a podcast by one of my favourite authors, actually, who I'll probably talk about today in some capacity, called Matthew Side. He does a podcast on BBC Sounds called Sideways, which is all about kind of looking at things from a different angle and kind of being questioning and curious. So, yeah. Very, very funny, very interesting guy.
Curiosity is a really good B2B trait, I think.
I imagine that, yeah, I can see that it's going to tie in nicely with the topic of the conversation today. I'm sure we've got a lot to cover. So we're here today to talk specifically about creativity in B2B, you know, why it's important, how you can use creativity effectively in B2B. And I think what we're going to do is start off by talking a bit about the why, essentially, because I think we've all worked in B2B marketing for a long time, all three of us. I think we're all very aware that sometimes it's the poor relation to consumer, certainly from a creativity perspective, or certainly perceived that way. So, Victoria, what is creativity in B2B to you, and why? Tell us why you're so passionate about it.
Oh, well, good question. We're all consumers in our day-to-day life, and you know, we have decisions that we make when we want to buy something that sometimes are quite on a simple level, like, oh, I love the visuals of this brand, like I connect to its story. B2B is obviously quite different because you're wearing various different hats as a consumer, and you know, you're working, usually you're buying for your company. So there's lots of kind of different factors in the decision-making process, I think, which makes it more multi-layered. And I think, you know, you've got to be communicating that, like, you can provide the service that the person wants or needs. And then, you know, I think sometimes people think you don't have to be as creative in B2B, or there's not as many opportunities for it. But I kind of would think I think there's more, because, you know, I think, you know, in a market which might be quite crowded with lots of people who are kind of potentially offering the same thing, I think there's much more opportunities to stand out. And, you know, if you can bring like a different perspective to something, or you can inject a little bit of creativity in your B2B marketing, I think it really can make you stand out from the crowd, which is quite exciting for me as a marketer.
I think it's a really interesting point that you raised, because you started by saying about B2C, you know, when you're buying goods or services as a within a B2B space. But I think that's the thing that we forget when we get into B2B, that actually we're still marketing at the end of the day to humans. One way or another, they're still humans at the end of it. And I've read a couple of really interesting things about the emotional appeal in B2B. And is it as important as it is in B2C? And I feel it absolutely has to be, because we're all selling to humans. So I think Rob and I talked in the past about B2B2C. You know, eventually you still end up with the consumer. How do you feel about that? Get the buying cycles, etc., are different, but do you think the emotional side is just as important?
I think it is, because I think a lot of the time it's a given that your business, I mean, I'm lucky because I've always worked for like market leading companies, and So, you get in through the door, you're talking to a prospect, and you give them all the assurances that you're more than capable of doing the project or providing the requirement. But then it's like, well, what more can you do? Like, why should I be connecting with you as a person? And because, again, professional services is all about people delivering that service. So, you have the company, you have the technology, you have the infrastructure that sits behind the service. But in almost every B2B scenario, at the end of the day, people are communicating with people and you're buying from people. And people they want to buy from people that they feel who get them. Both, they get their business, but they also get like who they are as a person and what their priorities are. I do think it's really, really important. And I think, fundamentally, yes, of course, you have to be able to do a really great job. But then it's like, well, what's the next step? Is actually, can I relate to this person? Do they understand how I tick? Can I understand kind of what's really important to them at the end of the day? So yeah, I think, at the end of the day, we are all human, and yeah, there's different aspects that come into play when you're buying on behalf of your company. Personal chemistry is so important, and it might be different in other sectors. I mean, like I say, I've worked predominantly in professional services, and that is very people-driven sectors. There may be slightly different shifts in other sectors like technology or SaaS maybe, but yeah, definitely in my experience, it all comes down to the people.
Yeah, I think, just to add, I think the long, you're talking in B2B, you've got those really long sales cycles as well, haven't you? From kind of a brand not being known necessarily by the customer at all through to actually the customer signing on the dotted lines. You've got to sustain that awareness for a long period of time. Whereas in a consumer environment, you might simply be, the brand, it might already be known, if it's Heinz Beans, or that's a silly example, but the brand there may already be a good awareness of the brand, or certainly what it does, because it's a simpler proposition. And also there may be more intent or more need or more perceived need from the consumer to do it. So creativity to me in consumer is much more kind of short term, big bang, whereas creativity in B2B has to be kind of constant. Sometimes it's more subtle and it's more small steps, but it has to keep rolling on, throughout that sort of journey, sales journey, basically. Can you really be creative around all B2B topics? I mean, let's face it, some of them are pretty deadly boring and dry, Victoria. So,
yes, I believe you can. Like, no matter how like dry or functional maybe your service might be. So my first job, I was working for a company that provided quantity surveying services for capital projects. And it's nobody kind of goes to sleep and dreams at night about what their next quantity surveyor might look like or might be able to do for them. So yeah, that could potentially be perceived as quite a dry area. But I think there's loads of ways you can make it creative. If you can make somebody laugh, you can stand out, you can differentiate yourself, and you can connect. When you can be creative, I think what you're saying to the person is, I care enough about you as a client to go that extra mile. To be memorable, or to make you connect with me in a different way, or to differentiate myself, and also just think creatively. So many of the solutions that companies offer require creativity. They require kind of resourcefulness and thinking on your feet and creativity. And so if creativity is not coming across in your marketing, I use an accountant. We probably all use an accountant. I would like my accountant to be creative sometimes. And so if I was looking for an accountant, I would probably be looking for an accountant who showed a little bit of, common sense and pragmatism and maybe a little bit of creativity. That's probably the most boring thing that you can possibly buy. But then, yeah, you see tons of accountancy firms who do really creative things, and those are the kind of the ones that I would choose.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think you're absolutely right. In terms of the dryness of the topic, I will challenge you on that one. I spent a day at Accountex, which is a financial services exhibition, big exhibition in Manchester a couple of weeks ago. And I went in thinking, oh my God, this is all going to be grey suits. And I was blown away by the creativity that they'd rolled out. And I think it's exactly that. you've got to show people that you care enough to be creative about it. There was a couple of organizations there, companies there that had the most outstanding brands. And I just thought, in terms of capturing attention as you walked in, you could see them, they stood out. And yet, one of them selling invoice management or something, I can't even tell you, but I will remember the brand. I remember the logos, all of the comm side of it, in a really positive way. So even the most dry topics are using creativity. Completely agree. And I think as well, if you've got a dry topic, use humor. I mean, absolutely use humor. Have the ability to, turn in on yourselves and take the mickey. And I think I think it's Slack. So, the driest, most technical product in the world. There is nothing humorous about Slack from a product perspective at all. But their marketing, I think, is really funny and very humorous. They ran some ads where they set up some fake companies, but the fake companies were just exacerbating the stuff that you do already. So it's like, yeah, she's just using it to send funny memes. And it's like, well, absolutely, because we all do that. So it really did connect on a very humorous level. And I think that's definitely a way to go when we're doing very dry topics in B2B.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think, when you've got a marketplace where there are lots and lots of companies out there that can probably provide a similar level of service, then creativity is what makes the difference. It's why someone's going to buy from you and not your competitors.
It does kind of lead into the next point, really, which is, and I think we have talked a bit about this, but how do B2B audiences respond to creative approaches? Do you think? I mean, we talked about the fact that everyone's a consumer at the end of the day. Perhaps, are we seeing a change in the way people respond? Are people, because of like work and life is kind of a bit more merged now, isn't it, than it used to be? Do you think people are more accepting of more creativity in a B2B, in a B2B comms channel than they were potentially in the past?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm giving away my age here, but I started in marketing 20 years ago, nearly 25 years ago now. And, I think there was very much a place for it there. I remember we used to do a lot of things back in those days when we were pitching to new clients. And, I might sort of cover this later when we're talking more about examples. But, and I do think people do respond to it. I think I think you made a good point, Rob, about as long as it's pitched right, that it aligns with your overall brand message, I think you can have a little bit of fun with it. I'm not talking about like CEOs doing TikTok dances and stuff like that. I think we're all pleased that era kind of came and went. And yeah, but I think there's definitely ways to do humor. I mean, I remember a campaign Silverdor did, and I think it was probably 10 years ago, and we did a series of print adverts. So it was a while ago, where we kind of juxtaposed the experience that you'd get in a service department versus the experience you'd get in a hotel. And we kind of had like two different, really different experiences, like someone trying to like iron their shirt on the desk, someone like sat on a bed, like eating a takeaway on the bed and constantly being interrupted by the maid while he's getting changed. And I think like we had loads of fun with it because it was like, staying in you're kind of over hotels, but look at all the things you can get in an apartment. You get your own space, you get more privacy, you get more space. So definitely, I think that that we were doing it a while ago, and I think that it was going down really well. And I think it is a way that you can stand out because lots of companies are quite conservative, and I sometimes think just because you're selling something serious doesn't mean that you can't have fun with it.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect way to explain it. Just because it's serious, it doesn't need to be marketed that way. What about, and this is probably a kind of segue a little bit. So I read recently a report, I think it was on LinkedIn, where they'd done some research with global B2B marketers, benchmark report. And one of the findings was very much that global CMOs currently feel that the most important skill in B2B marketing is creative strategy, not campaigns, not delivery, in the strategy. Do you think we apply the same kind of creative approach into strategy as we do into delivering?
Oh, that's a really good question.
That's a tricky one.
Do we into creative strategy? No, I probably don't think we do. I think the creativity often comes into play more at the tactical level. Um,
Mm,
and more in my experience, maybe it should come into play. But then sometimes I do think creativity is one of those funny kind of intangible things that you can't really plan for sometimes. And like a lot of people think it's like a magic art that if you're not creative, people are like, oh, well, I'm not creative. And I don't buy that. Like everyone can
no.
be creative, and I think there is, I think we may cover this later, like the science behind it and how you can become more creative. But yeah, it's a good question. Should we incorporate creativity more into the strategy? I don't know. It's a hard one. I think it often comes into play at the tactical level. What do you think?
I think I agree. I think the strategy is often overlooked, but I think that comes back to where you get a great creative idea, but it doesn't necessarily match what the broader comms strategy is. So the way I see it, there's often a gap between, you've got the business will have its core proposition and its messaging clear, and then it'll have its tactics over here. But what they miss is sort of the glue in the middle, which is actually what's the creative proposition that so if that working that out, what are you actually trying to sort of peddle from a marketing message perspective, or not a message perspective, but more from a creative perspective, and then
Yeah.
building your creative ideas on that. That's the bit that is the weakness, obviously, often, I think.
But that's the thing. I think if you can top down it rather than bottom up it, which is often the creative approach, is to go, okay, well, that's the strategy, but we've got a great idea. Let's run with that. I think you're right. It's that bit in the middle that gets missed. Whereas if you were top downing from, let's start with and the creativity doesn't need, to be fun and games. It can just be a really innovative, very different approach to something that then filters out into the creative ideas. I think that's probably where we're not, as in B2B, maybe not as good as they do in B2C. I think sometimes they think more creatively at the strategy level.
Yeah, and
they have bigger budgets.
Yeah, they invest more in it, don't they? Brand strategy and all of that. So
yeah.
Okay, let's move the discussion on a bit. So we talked about why, but let's talk about how now. So how do you do it? How can B2B marketers up their creativity game? How can they become better at this if they're struggling with it? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, so since we first had this conversation a few weeks ago, Rob, I've put so much thought to this because I think I'm personally quite a creative person. Like I have lots and lots and lots of ideas that I'm constantly like coming into my team in the morning and be like, oh my God, guys, I had this really good idea. We should try this. And it's like, and I am constantly kind of coming up with, and half the time they are just like completely out there. Like we would never do them. But I am quite like, I find it quite easy to come up with ideas. However, so I'm trying to like put myself in the position of somebody who maybe doesn't operate that way, and trying to think about how we do it in a team. So yeah, I have put a lot of thought to this. How can people up their game? I think there's loads and loads of ways of doing it kind of in a team if you're not necessarily a creative person yourself, but you are leading a team. I think one of the main things I think you can do, and I think there's lots of kind of tactical things, but I think the main thing you can do is, as a leader, is develop a culture and an atmosphere where people don't feel afraid to come up with a crazy idea. And I feel like in my team, because of what we're like, what I'm like, I come in with these like completely nuts ideas sometimes, is that it creates an environment where everyone feels okay to like, we're forever kind of screenshotting things that we're seeing on social media, adverts that we're seeing on TV. It's just stuff that we see out and about on our WhatsApp group. We're forever like screenshotting things and taking photos of things like, oh, this is cool. We should try this, or I love this idea. Just apropos of nothing most of the time, but just being interested and enjoying kind of seeing what other businesses are doing, whether it's in totally different sectors. So I think definitely like the first thing would be try to create an environment where, and it's such a cliche, but like there's no such thing as a bad idea, because if you create that environment where everyone feels really, really comfortable to just suggest something, if they've had a random thought about something or seen something that's cool, create an environment where they feel fine to suggest it. is probably one of the kind of main things as leaders I think we can do. And sometimes, like in a kickoff meeting, for example, we will start a discussion if we've got a project, creative project, like our Christmas video, for instance. We will start the kickoff meeting with, okay, let's think like money, no object, time, no object, logistics, no object, resource, no object. Let's like take all those things off the table. What would be really cool? And start the conversation there. And I know it's like blue sky thinking, but it is very much like, okay, this would be awesome. And you start with all this. And obviously, yeah, time is always a factor. Budget's always a factor. It's all obviously a factor. But you start with that. Let's just take all those limitations off the table and see where people's ideas go. And so often, what we'll end up doing will be some iteration of one of those ideas. And yeah, it might be like massively scaled back, or it might look totally different, or we might have found a different way to do it. But so many of our best ideas have come from that like crazy, no holds barred discussion, where you take away, let's forget what the board will approve. Let's just pretend we have totally free reign.
I love that. I think removing limitations and boundaries, and it's the definitive white blank piece of paper, isn't it? Scenario. It's just like, if it was everything was equal, what would we do? And I think you're right. It's about kind of enabling people. So if you've got a team that are pretty diverse, but not necessarily the person that's brave enough to speak up the whole time, or somebody that doesn't see creativity as a core skill, actually creating no boundaries is really, really enabling for them. I think it's quite a powerful way to start anything. And you're right. Somebody comes up with one thing, and it's not necessarily the idea that you go for, but it just trickles into something else that someone else then shapes into something else. And it goes on and on and on. So inevitably you're back at a point where you're like, actually, this could work. This could really work. I think that's such a lovely way to do it. No boundaries, no limits. No such thing as a bad idea.
That, I think, diversity is something we wanted to talk about, really, which I think is, how do you deal with that? Well, is diversity important to creativity, but also how do you deal with those, that diversity of the way people think and the way people behave if you're trying to create ideas?
Oh, well, I think you've touched on a really, really important point, actually, Rob, about just how the creative process looks like for different people. So like, you're very much like, I've got this idea and I've really developed it, and when I bring it to the table, I don't particularly want everyone to kind of pick it up and run with it, because like that's kind of what I want it to look like. Whereas I feel like me and Claire are probably more like, I've got this idea, I don't quite know what it's going to look like yet, but I'm sure we can figure it out. But you're right, like two very, very different approaches. And how do you make sure that like you don't end up feeling totally like your idea has been totally violated and looks nothing like what you actually wanted it to look like in the end? I don't know, I think sort of as leaders we probably have to try and kind of put that aside. And I think one of the notes I've made actually is around like creating this safe culture of creativity and ideas. I think one of the things we have to be able to do as leaders is accept that it may not always look like you would do it. So you give your people, you empower them to kind of come up with ideas, make decisions, run with them, have a go, try it. And it may not end up looking like how you would do it, but I think the trade-off for that is they then start to like create more of those ideas themselves, and you're obviously developing your team and upskilling your people. And yeah, I think we have to let go of some of our own ideas maybe about how you may have something in your head, but at the end of the day, if you're running a team or managing a team, you have to accept that sometimes the team just will run with it, and to let that go and think that it's better that they're running, like having children. Like they have to like go and do that themselves. Yeah, and maybe, like I say, it might not look exactly how you'd originally planned it, but that's what they created, and I think that's going to be ultimately more rewarding for them, and is going to mean that they'll create more and more and more ideas.
I've got a left field question. So when we're talking about the how, so what about the role of things like AI in creative delivery and in the how side of it? So back to this benchmark report that I read on LinkedIn, they were saying that something like 2 out of 3 CMOs are using AI, which is apparently a 20% increase for B2B marketers on the year before. But only 1 in 4 said that they had a really good understanding of how to use it in marketing, which to me just indicates a massive need to upskill and do some learning, which, comes with its own constraints and issues sometimes. But, is there a role for AI? We're very critical. I love AI, but I'm very critical of it, and its shortcomings. Is there a role for that to play in terms of creative delivery, do you think?
I think yes, definitely, but in the sense that it can free up loads of time doing menial, like time-heavy work, which can then free us up to let our creative energies flow. Because, so for example, we use AI we have very clear kind of boundaries with it. We absolutely do not use it as a content creation tool. However, we do often use it as to take lots and lots of content that like we've written and then summarize it. So, we definitely don't use it to create. We use it to, so we do a lot of interviews with our members of staff when we're talking about a case study or, a project for an award submission or something. We'll get lots of people in a room and we'll talk around subjects. We'll get lots of people's insights into a project and how we were innovative and how we differentiated and why we did a great job. That could be an hour and a half's meeting.
Yeah.
That previously somebody would have to, back in the day, they'd be making notes, but then obviously we would then record it, but then someone would have 90 minutes of recording that they would be typing up. And now we would just put that transcript through the platform we use, other platforms available. We'll put it through Otter, and it will not only type it up nicely, but it will summarize it into key headings. And Chris made a really good point on this. And and then you suddenly have something much closer to an article that then again, obviously, you would have a human being revisit that article, go through it again, make sure it all made sense, make sure it was right. But a huge chunk of time, which was basically menial writing up of notes, has been taken out of that process, which means that where we might have been able to do 4 case studies a week, we can probably do 8, and they'll all be just as good. So I definitely think, yes, there is absolutely a very important place for quality control, sense checking. I mean, we can spot if someone's used ChatGPT to write something. I mean, you can spot it a mile away, can't you?
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
But I think, people who in marketing should not be scared of AI. I don't think we should see it as a threat, because that authentic voice, like I've just said, you can spot it a mile off if it's been created by AI. That authentic kind of human voice will I don't think ever be replaced. And that's where we can really add value. And if you're using AI to take away a huge chunk of the meaning of things, like doing your expenses, think about all the kind of boring things, repetitive tasks that you have to do in the course of a month. And actually, if a robot could take away 60% of that, how much more creative could you be?
As a result, absolutely. So very much AI as a support tool to enable the creative process rather than replace it.
Yeah. Exactly. You still have to come up with the idea of what you're going to do. The people have to say it. It doesn't plug any of those gaps. What it does is it plugs the very resource intensive kind of boring stuff.
Yeah, I think I only agree, really. I think one example we've got is because we do a lot of original research as part of marketing campaigns that we run for clients, and the research companies that we're working with are now sort of introducing AI tools to help extract more angles from the data. So you typically do a 20-25 question piece of research, and you probably use about 50% of it in the campaign, because there's so much depth to it, really, especially if you've got complex questions in there. But using AI, you can sort of ask it and say, have we got any, is there a good angle around this? Could we do something around this? So it makes it much more usable in kind of response to market trends and things that are going on. If something happens and it's in the media agenda, do we have some stats that will support that? And the AI can sort of pull together 4 or 5 pieces of statistical evidence that together are quite strong. Otherwise you'd probably be like, no, I don't think we've got anything there, or we haven't got time to look at it. So it does kind of, it gets that rolling, doesn't it? Which is good. Right. Okay, so lots of great tips around how to go about it. I think that's going to be great value to our audience today. Let's delve a little bit further into that in terms of what practical examples have you actually got to share, Victoria? So when does it work really well for you, this creativity business? So let's know.
Okay, well, I've probably got two examples from my whole career, but two that really stand out to me. So the first one, I think we talked before about the kind of the mechanics of creativity, about looking at, take out all the limitations. Another kind of way of looking at is like the normal solution, the surprising solution, and the crazy solution. And that was one of the things, I probably meant to mention earlier, but it kind of is along the same lines. It's like, okay, so your normal solution will be kind of what we always do, and then you go surprising, and then you go crazy. So it's just another kind of way of looking at that no holds barred way of thinking. So I remember a big client pitch that I was working on many, many years ago. And we got through the number of stages, and it got to like one of the final big pitches. And they were asking us about, talk us through some of your previous projects, which is a pretty standard like pitch kind of question. And we used that process, and we were like, okay, well, what would the normal solution be? Okay, the normal solution might be a PowerPoint or a document. And then it was like, well, what would the surprising solution, the crazy solution look like? And the crazy solution that we ended up doing it in the end, was that actually, why don't we go and pick them up, the team of decision makers, and take them on a tour of the city I was lucky at the time because I worked for a company that had worked on lots of the big kind of iconic buildings in Manchester. And so it did lend itself very well. So we picked them up from their office, and on the way to our office, we took them on this little tour, and we gave them a printed map of where they were going to go to. And it had the little, we'd drive past, and it had it on their map, like it was this project, and this is what we did on it. And we had this like map of the city, and we took them on this little tour kind of on the way to the office. And so, it was obviously, it took a lot of organization, but it just kind of started the pitch out on such a great note. Like they were immediately like, okay, this supplier, they think about things differently. They probably received 5 other documents, or they probably had like 5 other PowerPoints, but that one, which is the one you're going to remember? So that was an example of kind of the normal, the crazy and surprising. And for the same project, actually, we did, so a lot of the time, stakeholder analysis is a key part of a successful bid. Sometimes the normal solution might be actually not to do a stakeholder analysis at all, but so your normal solution might just be a stakeholder analysis on an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, what's this person's role? What we ended up doing is we had a whole wall of like the bid, and we had pictures of all the decision makers, and we had like everything we knew about them, all their career history, what they were interested in, what was, things that had happened to them, stuff they'd talked about, subjects we knew were important to them. And it honestly ended up looking like, like one of those like FBI walls where they've got all the witnesses and suspects. And it was just like this huge room. And of course, you're not always going to do something like that for every bid. But this was like a huge bid for the company. And we wanted to just go all out on it. And luckily, I was working with a team of directors who were just incredibly keen on, really, really doing the surprising and the crazy solution. So yeah, those were 2 examples and we won it. So, and, it was a huge, huge success for the company. So yeah, those were 2 examples, I think, of where we use some of those strategies to be like, okay, this is how we would normally approach it, but actually, how can we do something that's really, really different and surprising? And yeah, maybe a bit crazy. So yeah,
I love,
a couple of examples.
I love that. So you start with your normal, what you would always do, then you look at what could be surprising, and then you look at what's absolutely crazy. How often do you end up in the crazy over the normal?
So often
Do
elements of the
you?
crazy,
Mm.
like elements of the crazy end up being part of it. It's often that, like, actually the crazy ideas are not really the crazy ideas. They're just crazy because you don't do them.
And you're
Like,
pushing
they're not
boundaries, aren't
really.
you? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You're limited, especially if you've been at a company a long time. Like, you are definitely probably conditioned a bit. Like, oh yeah, this is just what we've always done. So yeah, that's just, another way of kind of looking at that blue sky thinking
I
approach.
love that.
Yeah, so that was probably the first example. Where else? Oh, so the second example was probably one of our Christmas videos. So Silverdor, that is, as I said, corporate housing provider, probably wouldn't be the first choice of company that would spring to mind if you thought, like, this company is going to do a Christmas video. But we started doing them. We used to always do Christmas cards. And then a few years ago, so we always used to do a big photo shoot for the Christmas card. Anyway, then COVID came along, and we couldn't obviously get anyone together to do a Christmas card. And so we decided to do a video. And then that was born, really. That idea was born. So out of necessity was born kind of a new direction for the Christmas video. And so now every year, and I think, like, we touched on this at the beginning, I think, about how do you sell creativity maybe in a slightly risk-averse environment. And I think there's a really good point to say, right, you start out with you get your objectives signed off, and you say, right, it's got to be international, it's got to be relevant to the corporate housing industry in some way, it's got to include all our global offices, it's got to be Christmassy, it's got to be funny, it's got to be this, isn't it? And really, really define your objectives, and then get those signed off. Everyone go, yep, we're good with those objectives. Then it kind of leaves you quite a lot of, like, leeway to say, we've got this really good idea, and look, it ticks every single objective. And they're kind of like, well, yeah, it does. So we did a Christmas video for a couple of years. So our last year's one, or the year before, was probably my personal favourite that we've ever done, and it was when we were accommodating Father Christmas. So we had to do, like, it was like a mock inquiry, and so we had, people on the end of the phone being like, right, he needs parking for a large vehicle, and he's got, okay, nine pets, 9 large pets, okay. And then, of course, I mean, as it went on, it was obvious that it was Father Christmas that was making the inquiry. And then, yeah, in the end, like, we checked him in. So it was funny, like, it was, but it did, it ticked all the boxes. All the global offices had to work together to get this inquiry, because he was going all around the world, so he needed loads and loads. And so we incorporated all the, he needs to have an open, like, it needs to have a fireplace, and it was a really, really challenging inquiry, but obviously it ticked a lot of boxes about, like, personal service, and, like, lots of offices working together to accommodate really exacting guests. So it ticked a lot of those boxes for the business, and so there were there were just no barriers, because we were like, it does everything we need it to do, and it's also really fun.
But that's such a great way of looking at creativity, though, isn't it? Because if you can make sure that your objectives are so solid and your idea is tying straight back into them, it doesn't matter how crazy or creative it is. If it's tying back into those objectives, as you said, there is no argument. It's like, you know what, it does the job it needs to do. So why not take that? You almost de-risk it a little bit in terms of how crazy it may be, because you're providing that kind of solid KPIs against it. Definitely. But I think as well, what's really useful, really helpful, is to hear those experiences of the real, the campaigns that did work. We should probably revisit this another time and do the ones that didn't work and find out why they didn't work, to see if there's any learning in it. But I think I love, just hearing about people's different approaches to creativity and what spurs them on. And I think we covered a lot of that today. I've written down normal, surprising, crazy, because I just think that's such a good concept. It really is.
Definitely,
it's definitely served me really well. And I also think, and another thing that I think would definitely be really important thing to remember is don't let like the lack of perfection stop you from just trying something, because an idea will evolve. Somebody might come up with an idea and I'll be like, yeah, let's try it. And like the first one might not quite hit the right note, but then the next one will be better. And then the idea will evolve and everyone will get more comfortable with the concept. And then people will start, we try things like that quite a lot. And again, like I say, social media is such a good way to try those things out and see. You get that instant feedback. And then again, if it's not quite what you imagined it to be, then it's gone in a few days. Nobody really will remember it. And then you can take those learnings and make sure the next one is even better. And you will find that ideas just do constantly evolve. And the openness to be able to say, okay, that was really good last time, but how can we make it better?
Marginal gains. I love it.
Marginal gains.
It's
all about those marginal gains.
Yeah, absolutely.
What a good note to end on. I think I think if we can end by, I guess if there's one piece of advice you give to other people in your position from a creativity perspective, what would that be?
I think it is probably around not taking it too seriously. Even if what you're selling is a very serious thing, try not to take it too seriously. And then again, it's that accept that something might not be exactly how you would do it, but that is the price you pay, I think, for seeing a creative culture evolve in your team. And there are some things that will get executed that you're like, oh, I wouldn't have quite done it like that, but like, don't nitpick, because there's nothing that kills creativity more than a manager who nitpicks. So yeah, I would say, if you want to kind of generate a healthy creative culture within your team, definitely, yeah, be supportive. Like, no such thing as a bad idea. Don't nitpick, and constantly be focused on, how can we do it better.
Victoria, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your creativity journey with the listeners. I'm sure there are lots of pieces of advice and inspiration they can take and act upon there. So thanks again. So Claire, what did you think? I mean, I thought it was really good. She had so much to give, and it was a really fantastic start to this series.
Definitely. But so many ideas, so many really good tips actually that you can take away and use. And it's lovely to see or to hear somebody in B2B that's really thinking about the creative process and how it can work and how it can manage. I think if I walked away with probably a couple of things, one about diversity of team and how important everybody is in that process, whether they think they're creative as well. I loved Victoria's, I don't buy it. When someone says to me they're not creative, I don't buy it. Everybody's creative, just in very different ways. So being able to build that culture of creativity, I think, absolutely, completely agree. And I loved her examples. I loved the Father Christmas video. I think that was such a great way to bring to life what they do,
I don't know how we're going to top that.
But do it, it's a great tone of voice for them. It's a great branding opportunity, and it's just a really lovely way to deliver key messaging. So I think that was great.
I think one thing that struck me was really you need, like you were talking about having a cheerleader, and I think it's more than that. You need to have like all of the sort of bits in place, like you need to have somebody who can go and convince the board that it's the right thing to do, especially if you're going to have to get sign off. You can't have a really junior team and no senior sponsor behind it, otherwise they're just going to be like, well, you haven't argued the case significantly well enough for it or whatever. So you really do need that diversity to get it right.
And you're right, the objectives as well. I mean, that's exactly where the objective setting comes in. Every creative idea needs the objectives, and we often when we get caught up in that creative flow, forget that actually it's got to serve a purpose. But if you've got that senior person that's thinking the whole time, how does this tick these boxes? The boxes that I've got to be able, you've got your argument for the board. You've got, every valid reason. There is no way they can say no to it.
Yeah, I think, and the one thing actually I thought we could steal from it is this kind of idea of it always being on. So there's sort of when Victoria was saying about like the mood board, you just like getting everyone to be seeing and thinking things, and if maybe it's just a WhatsApp group, I can't bear for there to be another Teams group. Otherwise, I'll never get used.
I don't think the Teams group is immediate enough. I think the WhatsApp
No.
channel is much more immediate. So when you're walking through the city centre and you see a billboard that you think, God, that's so clever, just being able to take a picture and uploading it. And again, some team members are better at sharing those kind of ideas than others. And I think if you could create that mood, I think it's a great idea, because actually, whenever you're stuck for a bit of inspiration, all you've got to do is do a bit of scrolling to come back and go, oh, actually, you could do it, take that, but do it this way. It's like Pinterest for creativity in B2B. That's what it is.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's brilliant.
Brilliant. Excellent. All right. Well, yeah, we'll see you soon. And,
okay, thanks.
Yeah, till next time.
Till next time. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Shaking the B2B Tree, the podcast bringing you real-life insights and strategies from B2B marketing professionals who think and act differently. Our mission is to help our listeners with many of the common challenges we all face in B2B marketing. I hope you found today's discussion thought-provoking and of practical help, and we'd love to hear your feedback on future topics you'd like us to explore. For more conversations with guests shaking the B2B tree, why not subscribe to the series, or look out for our next episode on all major podcast channels and on LinkedIn. Bye.